So, Prince William and Catherine have now confirmed that Queen Camilla has been directed to leave Windsor Lodge. And the way this situation unfolded is genuinely more unusual than most people appreciate, because for weeks, Camilla had been conducting herself as though that property was permanently hers, not simply staying there, not merely making use of it, but carrying herself as though she held full authority over it. She was signing off on costly renovations, dismissing long-standing staff members, limiting which family members were permitted through the doors, and presenting the residence to visitors as though Charles had handed her the title outright. And nobody challenged her at first. That lack of pushback gave her the confidence to keep pushing further. But then, Catherine apparently noticed something Camilla had never expected anyone to find. A number of personal items connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had gone missing from the rooms where they had always been kept. They hadn't been misplaced, they weren't being claimed, they had been carefully wrapped, labeled, and transferred to storage under instructions that traced directly back to Camilla's office. William had never authorized it. Catherine had never been informed. The family wasn't notified at all until one frightened staff member finally broke ranks and spoke up. That single disclosure changed everything. What had appeared to be straightforward redecorating suddenly looked like a deliberate effort to erase Windsor Lodge's identity and replace it with Camilla's own stamp of ownership. Portraits had been relocated. Guest rooms had been reassigned. Family arrangements had been canceled without any explanation. Staff who raised questions were told the residents now answered to the Queen. Now, before we continue, if you're finding this breakdown useful and you'd like more royal updates as they develop, go ahead and hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. It takes just a couple of seconds and it genuinely helps the channel keep bringing you these stories. Alright, so Catherine didn't react with fury when she learned what had happened. She did something far more effective. She requested the records. Storage lists began coming in, then renovation approvals, then access directives, then written objections filed by household administrators. And one of those warnings stated plainly that certain items could not be moved without family sign-off. Camilla's office had received that warning. The transfer went ahead regardless. That was the moment William stepped in directly. He discovered that one sealed box contained something tied to Diana, an item he believed was shielded from being moved without his explicit knowledge. And for William, this was no longer a disagreement over furniture or room allocations. It had become a challenge to family legacy, to palace protocol, and to the boundaries of Camilla's authority. He wanted one answer. Who had given the final instruction? The paper trail didn't stop with some junior member of staff. It wound through Camilla's private office, past two separate objections, and into a chain of directives that treated Windsor Lodge as her personal domain. And here's where things became even more complicated. Royal funds had been drawn on to pay for alterations that had never been sanctioned. That revelation placed Camilla in a position she couldn't deflect using rank or ceremony. Catherine still attempted to keep matters from becoming public. She sent a private message asking Camilla to return the relocated items, lift the access restrictions, and pause the renovation work until the family could review everything together. Camilla's reply was dismissive. She stated that Windsor Lodge now fell under her authority and that Catherine should concern herself with her own household. That response did more harm than Camilla understood. Catherine had reached out privately precisely to spare Charles any embarrassment and to prevent a family rift. Rather than backing down, Camilla dismissed her outright and pressed ahead. Within days, more staff had been reassigned, another family visit had been scrapped, and a fresh set of directives described the lodge as Camilla's permanent home. But permanence demands documentation. When William requested the original occupancy paperwork, palace officials anticipated finding a signed grant, a revised lease, or a written directive from Charles. They found none. What they uncovered instead was a conditional arrangement, one that depended on continued family approval and appropriate use of the residence. And buried inside the language was a clause Camilla's office had apparently never read. If the property, staff, or royal resources were misused, the arrangement could be revoked. By the close of that evening, William and Catherine were no longer debating whether Camilla had overstepped. They were building the case to prove it. Catherine gathered every warning, every invoice, every storage log, and every blocked access request into a single file. William ordered a full audit, and somewhere inside Windsor Lodge, while Camilla continued behaving as though she were untouchable, officials had already begun examining the clause that could remove the residence from her control. Catherine's first instinct was not retaliation, but containment. She understood how quickly a private dispute could erupt into public spectacle, and she knew that Charles would be caught in the middle the instant Camilla felt cornered. So, she chose the measured path. A message was sent requesting a private meeting, away from staff, away from cameras, and away from the people already trading whispers through the corridors. The meeting was short. Catherine raised the missing belongings first. She explained that several pieces connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been moved without consultation, and that the staff changes were beginning to affect family access. She did not accuse, she did not threaten. She simply asked for the removals to be paused while William and the household administration examined what had taken place. Camilla did not yield. According to those with knowledge of the exchange, she replied with the assurance of someone who considered the matter resolved. Windsor Lodge, she said, now answered to her. The staffing decisions were hers. The renovations were hers. Catherine, in Camilla's estimation, should return her attention to her own household and stop involving herself in arrangements that were no longer her concern. That sentence altered the mood in the room entirely. Catherine had come to the conversation hoping to prevent humiliation. Camilla read the restraint as an invitation to be bolder. No apology was offered for the removed possessions, no acknowledgement of how family members had been affected, and no suggestion that anything might be reconsidered. Instead, Catherine was left with what amounted to a veiled warning dressed up as a dismissal. Step away, or the situation would grow more awkward. But Catherine did not step away. Over the following days, the restrictions tightened further. A family visit that had been approved weeks before was canceled without a reason given. 2 employees with long tenures were told their roles were under review. A guest suite that had been used during earlier family visits was handed over to Camilla's private guests. New aides began screening names at the entrance even when those names belonged to people who had walked freely through the lodge for years. The message was clear. Camilla was constructing control before anyone could question whether she was entitled to construct it. One employee described the atmosphere as careful and strained. Staff stopped speaking candidly in shared spaces. Instructions arrived by word of mouth, then were repeated through private messages that never appeared in the usual administrative logs. Some workers complied out of fear for their positions. Others quietly began setting copies aside. Catherine did the same. Every canceled arrangement was documented. Every staffing change was time-stamped. Every access request was filed next to the reply it received. She compiled storage logs, renovation records, security directives, and the names of those instructed to carry out each decision. What had started as a family disagreement was becoming a dossier. Then a former lodge employee came forward with the detail that drew William directly into the matter. The renovations were not being funded entirely through Camilla's private accounts. Invoices revealed that royal household resources had been applied to alterations that had never received proper authorization. Payments had been attached to broad maintenance codes designed to avoid drawing notice. New furnishings were logged as essential replacements. Decorative work appeared under structural upkeep. Staff assigned to official duties were being redirected toward Camilla's private arrangements. This was no longer a question of personal taste. It was a question of authority. When William was shown the records, he did not respond with the kind of anger Camilla might have prepared for. He went quiet. He read every page. He asked who had approved the payments, who had shifted the staff assignments, and who had sanctioned the storage of items connected to Diana. Every answer led back to the same source, Camilla's office. William then called for the original papers governing Windsor Lodge. Not a summary, not a briefing from an aide, the actual documents. He wanted the ownership record, the terms of occupancy, the funding conditions, and every amendment appended to them. Palace administrators began searching. Initially, those inside Camilla's circle assumed the review would confirm what she had been telling people, that Charles had granted her broad authority, that her position was secure, that William might object but couldn't undo anything without openly challenging the king. Then an archivist located a line buried deep within the residence file. The language did not describe permanent ownership. It did not confer an unrestricted lease. It referred to a conditional family arrangement, one dependent on continued approval and proper use of the property. And beneath that line was a separate clause. That clause had nothing to do with decor. It concerned misuse, unauthorized expenditure, restricted access, and the power to terminate occupancy when family property was treated as a private possession, one that Camilla's office appeared never to have read. William did not confront Camilla the moment the clause was identified. He waited until the residence file had been cross-referenced against funding records, staffing orders, and the instructions that had moved family possessions into storage. He wanted no gaps, no easy denials, no opportunity for the matter to be written off as a misunderstanding. By the time the meeting was arranged, he had seen more than enough. Camilla arrived expecting a conversation about procedure. William made clear it was about conduct. He placed the documents before her one by one. The canceled visits, the reassigned employees, the renovation charges, the access restrictions, the storage directive linked to Diana's belongings. Then, he asked the question she had been avoiding. What gave her the right? Camilla did not respond with a document. She responded with position. She said the residence had been placed at her disposal, the household understood her standing, and Charles had no objection to the changes. In her view, that was sufficient. The king's approval didn't need to be committed to paper every time she changed a staff member or adjusted a room. William disagreed. He reminded her that Windsor Lodge was not a personal reward. It carried family history, official obligations, protected objects, and arrangements spanning more than one household. A verbal understanding could not override written conditions, nor could it excuse the removal of belongings connected to his mother without telling him. That was when Camilla shifted her approach. She cautioned that pushing the matter further would embarrass Charles. Any public argument over the lodge would suggest the king was unable to manage his own family. It would generate headlines, deepen divisions, and raise questions about who actually held authority inside Windsor. The warning was calculated. William understood exactly what it meant. Back away, and the family avoided a scene. Press on, and he would be cast as the one who caused it. He pressed on. William ordered an audit of every decision made since Camilla began treating the lodge as her private domain. Officials were directed to examine occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of family belongings. Nothing would be accepted on the strength of reputation alone. Every claim required documentation. Catherine became the foundation of that audit. She had preserved the written objections submitted by household administrators. Some flagged that long-serving staff could not be dismissed without proper consultation. Others questioned maintenance budgets being used for private modifications. One message specifically asked Camilla's office to postpone the transfer of family objects until their status had been confirmed. The reply was brief: proceed as instructed. That single line removed any room for misunderstanding. Camilla's office had been informed of the limits. It chose to carry on regardless. More records followed. A security note showed names from William's household appearing on a restricted access list. A staffing memo designated rooms once available for family visits as being exclusively under the direction of Camilla's aides. An invoice included work commissioned before approval had been given. Piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to look past. This was not an isolated misjudgment. It was a system. The most striking evidence came from an administrator who had been present during an earlier planning session. Camilla had spoken about the lodge as though its future had already been decided. She had outlined new guest arrangements, a restructured staff model, and rooms that would no longer be available for shared family use. When someone asked whether permanent authorization had been received, an aide replied that nobody would challenge the Queen. The plan had been built on that belief. William's audit challenged it. By the time the review concluded, officials had reached a finding Camilla had not anticipated. Her position at Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, a permanent lease, or an unconditional royal grant. She had been permitted to occupy the residence under terms that required proper use, shared access, and respect for its purpose as a family property. The documents also gave the household the authority to intervene when those terms were violated. William requested one final confirmation. He wanted to know whether the clause could be enforced without requiring Charles to sign a new order and without Camilla's agreement. The answer came that evening. It could. But another detail came with it. Catherine's file showed that Camilla had received 3 separate written warnings before the review began. Each one explained that her authority was conditional. Each one asked her to reverse a specific decision. She had disregarded all 3. The palace was no longer considering whether Camilla had misread the arrangement. It was determining what to do about someone who had been cautioned, had understood what was at stake, and had continued anyway. The file William had ordered was no longer a collection of grievances. It had become a record of how Camilla's control had been constructed, decision by decision, while everyone around her assumed someone else had given approval. Catherine organized the material in order. First came the room plans, then the staffing schedules, then the storage records. After that came the security directives, the invoices connected to maintenance accounts, and the correspondence showing how objections had been handled. Not addressed, not debated, simply overridden. One photograph arrested William's attention immediately. It showed a sitting room before any alterations had begun. A second image taken just days later showed the same room emptied of several family pieces. The replacement furniture had already been moved in. A new portrait had been hung above the mantel. The room no longer looked like shared space. It looked like a claim. That was precisely the point. The changes had not been random. They followed a deliberate design. Camilla's private guests were given precedence, her aides managed access. Staff with loyalties to the previous household were moved away from key positions. Objects tied to earlier generations were removed from view. Every alteration made the lodge feel less like a family residence and more like an extension of her own private court. Catherine understood something then. Camilla's remark about focusing on her own household had not been uttered in frustration. It reflected a plan already underway. Catherine and William were not simply being asked to accept new furnishings, they were being edged out of a residence Camilla intended to control entirely. The most significant evidence came from a long-serving employee who had stayed silent until that point. The employee had been present when the first storage instructions were discussed and had watched discomfort spread among the older members of staff. Nobody wanted to defy the Queen. Nobody wanted to surrender a post held for decades. But one instruction had felt too serious to set aside. The employee had kept a copy. It was signed. The document ordered the removal of several protected items and instructed staff to complete the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. The timing mattered. It confirmed that the belongings hadn't been moved due to urgent repair work. They had been moved before William and Catherine could arrive and see what was happening. Then Catherine discovered the warning that had preceded it. Sent 2 days earlier, it stated that the listed items required family consultation and that no transfer should proceed until ownership and access had been confirmed. The removal instruction had followed anyway. Camilla's office had known. That discovery ended the last plausible claim that the dispute had grown from confusion. The instruction had not slipped past an overburdened office. It had been issued after the consequences had been laid out in writing. The mood inside the review team shifted. Officials who had been carefully measured began speaking with greater candor. The lodge had been treated as private territory. Royal resources had underwritten the transformation. Family access had been pushed aside. Still, Camilla's representatives attempted one last defense. They argued that Charles had granted verbal permission. That claim forced the review into its most delicate phase. Officials searched for anything that might support it: a signed letter, a revised lease, a royal warrant, a note from the king's private secretary, even a diary reference confirming that permanent authority had been discussed. There was nothing. Charles may have allowed Camilla to make use of the lodge. That was not the same as transferring ownership. He may have been aware she wanted changes made. That was not evidence he had approved the removal of protected belongings, the redirection of household funds, or the restriction of family access. A private conversation could not void conditions accepted in writing. William then asked whether occupancy could be terminated without triggering a constitutional dispute. Legal advisors returned to the clause and weighed it against every action catalogued in Catherine's file. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The conditions had been breached on multiple occasions, and the household held the authority to withdraw the arrangement. William and Catherine approved the next step. A formal notice was drawn up. It documented the breaches, instructed that all unauthorized work cease immediately, returned control to the household administration, and required Camilla's private staff to vacate the residence. There was one final line. The keys were to be handed over by a set deadline. When the notice reached Camilla, the reaction inside Windsor Lodge was immediate. Doors shut, calls were placed, staff were told not to comment. One aide insisted the decision would be reversed before morning. Morning arrived, nothing had changed. The deadline held. And as Camilla's office searched for anyone willing to intervene, palace officials were already drawing up inventories, access orders, and a handover security plan. For the first time, the question was no longer whether she would leave, but how she would handle it. The deadline arrived on a Windsor morning, and the vehicle that passed through the gates did not belong to Camilla. It carried 2 household officials, a security supervisor, and the inventory team responsible for overseeing the handover. No press waited outside. No statement had been issued. The palace wanted the transfer completed quietly before rumor could take a shape that was harder to manage. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides were already moving. Personal files vanished from desks. Garment cases were brought down the main staircase. Framed photographs were wrapped and placed beside labeled boxes. One assistant moved briskly between rooms, checking drawers and cupboards against a private list. Another stood at the entrance, demanding to know who had authorized officials to enter before Camilla had finished speaking with Charles. The answer was contained in the notice. Authority had reverted to household administration at the moment the deadline elapsed. From that point, no room could be sealed to inspection, no item could be removed without being logged, and no member of Camilla's private staff was permitted to remain beyond the final handover. The officials did not argue. They read the terms and began. That composure made the scene harder to bear. Camilla had anticipated resistance she could reframe as an affront. Raised voices would have let her claim disrespect. A confrontation in front of witnesses would have made William appear reckless. Instead, every step was unhurried, every box was recorded, every door was opened under documented authority. The process gave her nothing dramatic to push back against. Then the first dispute arose. A set of silver frames had been placed among Camilla's personal possessions, but the inventory listed them as part of the lodge collection. Her aide maintained they had been given as gifts. The officials asked for proof. None was provided. The frames stayed. A writing desk followed, then 2 paintings, then a cabinet containing correspondence from an earlier royal household. Each time the same principle applied. Personal property could go, family property could not. Room by room, the boundary Camilla had disregarded was being reinstated. William and Catherine were not there. That had been a deliberate choice. Their absence prevented Camilla from transforming the handover into a personal confrontation. Yet their authority was present in every document on the table. Catherine's records had established the pattern. William's audit had activated the clause. The officials were now carrying out a decision neither of them intended to walk back. Camilla entered the entrance hall before midday. She was composed initially. She asked to speak with the senior official, questioned the schedule, and said the residence could not be handed over while conversations with the king were still in progress. The official replied that no family discussion would delay the notice. The deadline had passed. The occupancy had ended. That was when the composure gave way. Camilla accused Catherine of engineering the entire humiliation from the start. She said the questions about staff and storage had been pretexts designed to undercut her position and present her as an intruder. Then she directed her anger at William. He was using Diana's memory, she said, to punish anyone who stood up to him. The room fell still. William's response had already been written into the handover instructions. The removal was not a matter of personal history. It followed repeated violations involving access, staffing, expenditure, and protected family property. No personal accusation could alter the record. Camilla rejected that. She demanded that one private sitting room be kept sealed until Charles made a personal determination about its status. Her aide produced a separate key and declined to place it with the rest. For several minutes, everything stopped. The security supervisor reviewed the notice. The senior official opened the full occupancy schedule. Every room within the lodge was listed. There was no private exception, no retained suite, and no continued right of access following termination. The last line of defense had collapsed. Camilla was informed that withholding the key would constitute a refusal to comply. The official did not issue a threat, he simply described what would follow. Security would open the room, document its contents, and note that the key had not been surrendered willingly. The aide looked toward Camilla. She gave a small nod. The key was set on the table. By late afternoon, the personal vehicles were ready. Camilla's staff left in stages, each departure observed by officials checking every parcel against the inventory. The final boxes were loaded. The entrance hall emptied. At the gate, one vehicle paused before pulling onto the road away from Windsor. Inside, silence settled. But the palace still had a decision to confront. Advisors counseled against any public confirmation. They believed the family could characterize the departure as a routine transition and let the story dissolve. William and Catherine disagreed. Too many people already knew. Too many records existed. Silence would simply leave space for another version to take hold. That evening, they decided to speak, and what they were prepared to confirm would make Camilla's departure impossible to frame as anything else. William and Catherine chose their words with precision, but there was no ambiguity in what they meant. Camilla had vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff no longer had authority over the residence. The keys had been returned. The unauthorized work had been stopped. Household administration had resumed responsibility for every room, account, and point of access. The confirmation spread quickly. Inside palace offices, aides understood what the public was still piecing together. This had not been a voluntary departure. It was the result of a review that laid bare how far Camilla had pushed while assuming she could not be challenged. She had treated the arrangement as permanent. The document said it was not. William did not mark the moment. He ordered the restoration to begin. Staff reopened the storage records and identified every object displaced during Camilla's time in the residence. They worked from photographs, inventories, and earlier room documentation. Items connected to Queen Elizabeth were separated from general furnishings. Objects linked to Diana were verified against William's records before being returned. One box stayed sealed longer than the others. It contained the personal item that had first pulled William into the dispute. The wrapping was untouched, but the label showed it had been earmarked for transfer elsewhere. Had the employee not come forward, the item might have disappeared into a broader royal collection, far from the lodge, and beyond the awareness of those who understood its significance. Catherine observed the restoration without casting it as a triumph. For her, the outcome had never been about wresting a residence from another woman. It had been about establishing a boundary. Shared property could not be seized through confidence alone. Family memory could not be stripped from a room simply because its presence made someone uncomfortable. Authority came with conditions, even when the person testing those conditions wore a crown. That principle was now part of the record. Long-standing employees who had been removed were contacted. Some were offered their previous roles back. Others were invited to assist in rebuilding the household structure. Guest arrangements returned to neutral oversight. Private aides lost the authority to determine which family members could enter. The lodge was no longer an extension of Camilla's office, but the victory carried costs. Charles now faced questions he could not easily set aside. How much had he known? Had he sanctioned the renovations, or had Camilla used his name because she believed no one would go directly to him? Was he aware that royal funds had supported private alterations? And crucially, did he know that belongings connected to his late mother and to Diana had been removed after written warnings were issued? No answers came. The silence shielded the king, but it did not restore trust. William had learned that family assurances meant nothing without documentation. Catherine had learned that quiet diplomacy could be mistaken for passivity. Camilla had learned that rank could delay consequences, but could not erase a signed clause once the evidence was assembled. The balance inside Windsor had shifted. Staff grew careful about verbal instructions. Administrators demanded written approval for decisions once handled through informal conversations. Security teams reviewed who held the authority to restrict access to shared residences. Every household absorbed the message. William and Catherine would hold anyone to account who treated royal tradition as personal property. Camilla's departure therefore meant more than the loss of one lodge. It marked the moment her authority met a boundary she could not move. She had assumed Charles's position would protect every decision she made. She had assumed Catherine would remain courteous, that William would sidestep any scandal, and that staff would hold their silence. Every assumption failed. The fall was of her own making. Had Camilla stopped after the first warning, the dispute might have ended without public notice. Had she returned the belongings, addressed the spending, or restored family access, William might never have launched the investigation. Instead, every refusal added another page to Catherine's file. Every attempt to consolidate control created another witness. By the time the notice arrived, the case against her had been constructed entirely from her own choices. By nightfall, the restored rooms had been inspected. The lodge was quiet again, but not with the tension that had preceded everything. It was the stillness that follows a reckoning, when everyone present understands the rules have been redrawn. William and Catherine had not simply removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had made clear that invoking Charles would no longer be sufficient, and that the next confrontation might carry even greater consequences.